Hey, fabulous biology students. Today I want to give the introductory talk in our study of human physiology, and I call it human form and function. And really what we're going to do today is take a look at some of the background ideas that will allow us to see the individual physiological systems that we're going to be studying in a bigger context, so that when you're deeply thinking about the digestive system, you will see the bigger picture. So when you're thinking about all the different tissues in the circulatory system, you will see the bigger pictures. So let's get started. All animals face a similar set of problems because they're multicellular. If you remember, all life began as single cells. But about 6, 7, 800 million years ago, multicellularity evolved. And as a result, there's a similar set of problems that had to be overcome. Let's think about this a little bit. The arrangement of cells in a multicellular organism is called anatomy. But how the cells function to maintain the organism in its living condition is called physiology. The comparative study of animals reveals that the form of the anatomy relates to the function and the roles of the cells. So form and function are related to each other. And we're going to see that over and over again in this unit. So we want to go forward now and explore the implications of being multicellular. What concerns do cells that are living together as a single organism have that unicellular organisms or single cells living on their own do not have? What are the needs of cells? Maybe you want to stop the video and write down some. Okay, you've stopped the video, you've written down your answers. Let's take a look. Well, first, molecules that provide energy and the building block molecules for all those large macromolecules. A cell needs a constant input of those things, of energy and building block molecules. Oxygen. Cells need to be able to do cellular respiration, so they need a constant input of oxygen. And finally, they need something to remove waste. So single cells get everything by directly interacting with the environment. They capture their food, they absorb molecules they want from the outside world, oxygen diffuses in, they eliminate waste into the outside world. But think about a multicellular organism. For example, what about a cell in my bicep here? Deep in my bicep, it can't hunt its own food. It can't get its own oxygen. The oxygen's out here. It's not in there. And if it puts all its waste around that cell, eventually the waste will build up to such a concentration that it will kill that cell. So the body systems that we're going to be studying are all evolutionary adaptations to provide for cellular needs in a multicellular environment. We're going to study, 6, 7, 8, 10, I don't know what number it's going to be, but some large number of body systems. And each one has a goal. So here I'm going to ask you what the goal is of several representative systems. First, the digestive system. What's the goal of it? Shut off the video, write it down. Okay, you're back. Did you say to break food down into its molecular components, the building block molecules, so that cells can transport those molecules across their membranes? If you did, give yourself a big pat on the back. Okay, next, the respiratory system. Take a deep breath, shut off the film, and write down its goal. If you said to take oxygen from the atmosphere and to put it into the circulatory system, that's really good. It's only half right, as it turns out. And we'll see what the other half is when we get to that system. What about the urinary system? What's the point of that? Shut off the video, write down your prediction. Are you back? Did you get to remove wastes from the bloodstream? And in fact, to remove cellular wastes from the bloodstream and then remove them from the body. And finally, what's the goal of the circulatory system? Well, if you said to carry input materials from their entry point in the body to the cells and to carry waste away from the cells to the points at which they'll be ejected from the body, very good. You can see that the body systems themselves, some of the great body systems, these are the first four we're going to study, in fact. Their goals, their design has been created to meet the needs of cells. Now, if you think about it, cells evolved in an aqueous medium. That means in a watery medium. They evolved in the ocean. In terrestrial animals, those cells no longer live in an aqueous environment. As a result, all animals need to maintain an aqueous environment for their cells inside their body. So our cells are all bathed in a solution called interstitial fluid that keeps the cells moist. And then we have a watertight skin to prevent that water from evaporating and dissipating into the environment. These cells need this watery environment so they can absorb dissolved substances by diffusion, and they can transport materials that diffuse to them across their plasma membrane. Natural selection acts to design body systems that maintain this aqueous environment for cells and therefore allow these cells to survive. Now, one thing I want to think about for a second is the size of cells. Cells can be very large, but the great majority, 99.9% of all cells are less than 100 microns. That's less than a tenth of a millimeter. All cells depend on the diffusion of material from their cell membrane to the inside of the cell. And since diffusion is fast, maybe by your and my standards, by the standard of a cell, it's not very fast. If there can be hundreds of thousands of reactions in a second in your cell, then the diffusion rate has to be able to supply the reactants in those chemical reactions very rapidly. So diffusion puts a limit on the size of the cell. If the cell got larger than, let's say, 100 microns, diffusion would not be able to supply the materials fast enough. So why are cells small? Well, if we think about it this way, the volume of a cell, where all these living processes happen, create the demand for input materials and waste removal. The volume is where all the reactions happen and where all the waste products are produced, and therefore they create a demand for new material and waste removal. But the amount of surface area on the surface of the cell limits the rate at which materials can cross the membrane. Cells have to have sufficient membrane surface area to be able to serve the entire volume. Well, here's a weird mathematical fact. The ratio of surface area to volume decreases as cells become larger. The larger you get, the relative amount of surface area per unit of volume gets smaller, and therefore large cells wouldn't have enough surface area to get the supply of inputs to be able to survive. Here's an example of this. The surface area of this cube is 5,400 micrometers squared or micrometers squared, but if we break these, this is a 30 by 30 by 30 micrometer cube. If we break it up into 27 10 by 10 by 10 cubes, the surface area now becomes 16,200 square micrometers. So the more membrane, the more diffusion, the more transport of material. This cell has relatively few surfaces compared to the volume. These 27 cells have a lot more surface area, and therefore they can supply the same volume a lot more quickly. So what we're going to see throughout our study of physiology is many systems are characterized by adaptations that increase surface area. Wherever exchange of material is important, such as across the lungs, where oxygen is being exchanged, such as in your small intestine, where nutrients are being absorbed, there's going to be adaptations to increase the surface area. Now I would like to switch topics for a second and talk about the development of a multicellular organism. We remember that all multicellular organisms begin as a zygote, a fertilized egg. But all multicellular organisms have many different kinds of cells. So how does it go from a single egg, which is a single type of cell, to many cells? Well, we know that's mitosis. But how do those cells become differentiated? How do they become different? Well, As mitosis proceeds, cells undergo a process in which they are channeled into one type of cell or another. Now, during early division, these cells are known as stem cells or embryonic stem cells because they retain the ability to develop into every kind of cell. And that's what a stem cell is. It still has the ability to develop into any kind of cell. After a while, there's a process known as determination, which commits each cell in the growing embryo to become a single type of cell. So they become determined. And then once they're determined, they're going to differentiate. But think of this. All these determined cells all contain all of the genetic information. We know by mitosis that they get all the genes, but they are no longer able to express that info through transcription and translation to become anything. They can only transcribe and translate a subset of it. And that is the process of differentiation. Committed cells then develop unique structures, unique processes, and this process is known as differentiation. Cells that can become anything are called totipotent cells. And so early on in the embryo, here's a zygote that's just been formed. The sperm enters the egg. And now here's a morula, that's an early stage in embryonic development. And these are totipotent cells that can become anything. But later on, when we're in the blastula stage of embryonic development, these internal cells here can only become a few types. They can become circulatory system, nervous system, or immune system cells, but nothing else. Pluripotent cells can become all cell types except for placental cells. And unipotent cells can become only one type of cell. So this is way beyond the scope of this course. But I just wanted you, in case you've heard these words or you'll hear them in the future, to know what they are. Now, I just want to do an aside on stem cell research. Because stem cells have the potential to turn into any kind of cell type, they are potentially very powerful therapeutic tools that could be used to replace or repair damaged tissue that wouldn't otherwise generate. We know that damage to nerve tissue is often severe because nerve cells won't degenerate. What would it be like if we could treat a spinal cord injury where there's a complete break with stem cells that would regrow nerve cells to attach both sides? You would take somebody who's fully paralyzed and return them to being fully mobile, at least in theory. The same is true with bone marrow transplants. If your bone marrow is producing cancerous cells, then it would be great to be able to treat your bone marrow with stem cells that would replace those bone marrow cells with non-cancerous cells. There are many sources of these cells. One of them are human embryos, and this has been controversial. And another has been umbilical cords. And it's all controversial, particularly by the right wing in the United States, who's made it an issue because of the anti-abortion movement. So stem cell research has been stopped in its tracks. This may be a moot point because recently we are discovering more and more how to induce pluripotent cells from certain adult cells. So how to make adult cells go backwards. But at any rate, this is what stem cells research is. This is its motivation. And I just wanted you to be able to understand that if you read newspaper articles about it. Let's move on. Here's an article from a scientific journal about stem cells. It's all you need to know. Multicellular organisms have different levels of organization. So let's think about this. We have many different specialized cell types, and they get together to form tissues, what we call tissues. And then tissues will interact and they will comprise an organ. And then organs are organized into, yes, I think you've got this, organ systems. So this is the way we think of multicellularity. Specialized cells make tissues. Tissues of different types can form organs. Organs can be organized into organ systems, and then those organ systems carry out functions that provide for the needs of these cells that have given up their autonomy to be part of a multicellular organism. Organ systems then interact with each other through feedback loops and communication systems. So you can see why it took 3 billion years of life for multicellularity to evolve. This is pretty complex stuff. Here are some of the specialized cell types. You don't need to know this really, I just want to show them to you. Connective, bone tissue, epithelial cells, smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, and there's several other types. Reproductive cells you can see there, etc., etc. Here are the tissue types. Tissues are groups of cells that have a common structure and function. Some of the most common tissue types are epithelial, which are the outer layers. For example, under the dead skin layer we have these epithelial cells that are making new skin cells. Connective, which are supporting, binding, protecting the various cells in our body. Muscle tissues, which have to do with motility and movement, whether it's movement of the heart muscles or movement of me when I'm fleeing a student who's asking me a really nasty question. And finally, nervous tissue, which receives and transmits impulses, which is information from the outside world and to parts of the body on how to respond. Here's a graphic that shows you how the primary tissue types are organized in the arm, and you can see some of this. You can read this on your own later on. Now, lastly, I want to talk about organs and organ systems, and then a little bit of an overview about how they communicate with each other. This is really amazing stuff. Different tissues work together to form an organ, and an organ is a structure that has a function for the organism. So, for example, the lung has all 4 tissue types. Clearly, I have to move muscles to breathe, and then I have epithelial tissues, there's connective tissue holding it together, etc., etc. When 2 or more organs work together, it's called an organ system. So the lung works with the circulatory system to transport oxygen from the outside world into the internal world, which is where the circulatory system is. The stomach and the small intestine and the large intestine work together in the digestive system. These are organ systems. And here now are some of the major organ systems in the human body with their main components and their main functions. And I'm going to leave that for you to read on your own time. You should know what all of these systems do. Here's another way to look at the organ systems. And here now they are sort of placed in the human body. And I like that. That's why I put this in here for you to be able to see this. So I want you to take a look at this on your own time as well. Multicellular organisms need to regulate their internal environment in order for cells to survive. I hinted at this earlier when I said that the interstitial fluid had to be constant. That means that there has to be a certain amount of aqueous solution around every cell. You'll quickly figure out that it has to be at exactly the right osmotic pressure. It has to have the exactly correct amount of dissolved substances so water doesn't flow one way or another by osmosis. Because you wouldn't want a cell expanding by osmosis and exploding, or contracting and shrinking by osmosis so that it couldn't function. This process of maintaining the internal conditions of the cells is called homeostasis. Cells can only function within a narrow range of temperature, pH, oxygen levels, osmolarity, which is that osmotic pressure. So that's what homeostasis is. And in order to maintain homeostasis, the body has to have control systems. So let's think about some of these control systems in the body. What are they like? Well, they have 4 parts. Sensors, that makes sense. A control center that can respond to the information the sensor picks up. A communication system, and then a target. So the sensors take data. Makes sense. The control center, which is usually the brain, compares the data with set points, what's supposed to be normal, and then sends messages via the communication system. The communication system, which is usually the nervous system, but can also be the endocrine system, sends messages to the target cells. And finally, the target changes its activity in response to the message. It does something in response to that message. We're going to see some examples of that, but first let me talk about feedback loops. Feedback is when the control center responds to a change in the condition. So negative feedback, the control system sets in motion actions that counteract the change in the condition that the control center notices. and they restore the initial conditions. So that's negative feedback. The negative is it's that the change that occurred is changed back to where it was. That's the negative part. It's not that negative feedback is bad. It's not that connotation of feedback. It's that the initial displacement is put back to equilibrium. For example, if your core temperature drops below 98.3 or whatever your personal core temperature is, the control center sends a message to the muscle cells to start to contract rapidly. That's called shivering. This creates heat because in order for the muscles to fire, they have to generate and use a lot of ATP, and there's a lot of waste heat from both of those processes, and that warms the body. That is a negative feedback loop. There's a change in the core temperature. The control center says shiver. That raises the temperature back to where it's supposed to be. Negative feedback. That's a loop that maintains homeostasis. Here's a positive feedback loop. Positive feedback loop occurs when a change in condition actually causes a response that increases the change in the condition. This term is called positive feedback because it derives from the microphone next to a speaker effect where you get that horrifically loud, ear-piercing screech. That's positive feedback because what happens is the microphone picks up the amplified sound and then further amplifies that, and then further amplifies that, and then further amplifies that, etc., until it exceeds the capacity of the speaker to work and it blows out. Similarly, when you get a cut, the body has a whole positive feedback loop so that clotting happens quickly. You have clotting begin, and as the clotting begins, they release more chemicals to accelerate the clotting until the blood flow slows down enough that a negative feedback loop can take over. Finally, organ systems work together to achieve homeostasis, and here's a diagram of it. To warm up the body, the muscular and the circulatory systems were used together. To cool down the body when it gets too hot, the skin is used as well as the nervous system. So you can use this diagram and follow a pathway here. Increased body temperature, brain senses it. Response, sweat. That is a cooling process. Response, dilate vessels in the skin to get more heat emanating from the skin. What about decreased body temperature? Contract blood vessels in the skin so you don't lose heat. Keep that heat internally. Shiver. Those are multi-organ system negative feedback loops that maintain homeostasis. So I hope you've gotten all these concepts today. And to quote Joe Jackson, right, that's enough. See you next time.